Well, joining us now is Victoria Gaytan in New York. She's the program manager at Global Americans, a think tank focused on human rights, democracy and social inclusion in Latin America. From London, we have Javier Farje. He's a Peruvian journalist and analyst in Latin America affairs. And completing our panel from Bogota is Marck Chernick. He's a former director of the Center for Latin American Studies at Georgetown University. And thank you all for joining us here on the Newsmakers. Let me begin with you, Victoria, and it's a question that I'll ask of all of you up front. Victoria, is corruption endemic in Peru?
Well, it is certainly a very worrisome problem, especially given the fact that President Peru's resignation last week is settling the country in a political instability that incoming President Martín Vizcarra will have to face, both domestic challenges, a fragmented Congress, Fujimorismo, and also international challenges. Right. The thing here is that the last 4 presidents of Peru have been involved in corruption scandals. We have Humala, we have Toledo, we have Garcia, and now PPK. This is a serious and a critical condition and a threat to the democratic institutions and the political institutions of Peru.
Okay, so my first question became boring then because we've moved on because you gave such a good answer, Victoria. Javier, let me ask you then, given that this has happened, the president's forced to resign because of corruption, Victoria gave us the history. This is not a new story. We've seen this movie before. So how can it possibly be a turning point if this has happened over and over again, and it just seems to continue to happen where presidents are corrupt as anything in this country?
That is the big challenge that Mr. Martín Vizcarra, the man who's replaced President Kuczynski, has in his hands. His promise to fight corruption is going to be extremely difficult for him to uproot such an endemic problem as our guest rightly said. This is a problem that has been going on for decades in Peru, and the 4 presidents she mentioned are just the latest chapters in this case of corruption. So his promise to foot. The problem is that corruption is not only the fact that a president might be involved in some kind of bribery issues, but also we're talking about a whole structure of the state is corrupt, from the highest office to the policeman who gets a small bribe not to give a ticket for bad parking to a car. We're talking about a huge problem in Peru at the moment. Thousands of pounds, thousands of dollars are lost because of this kind of corruption. And President Vizcarra, Martín Vizcarra, has promised that he's going to tackle these problems. Many people within the opposition, the very opposition that caused the downfall of President Kuczynski, said that they trust that he will start doing something about this. He won't have enough time because he won't be able to, he will have to finish the mandate, and this will need many years to be solved. But that is the biggest challenge that Mr. Vizcarra has. However, the corruption is so endemic in Peru that it's going to be probably tiny bit that he will be able to achieve if he manages to achieve anything as the new president of Peru.
Mark, the whole structure of the state is corrupt, according to Javier. Is that an exaggeration, or has he hit the nail on the head?
Well, I think it's neither. I mean, in some ways, I think it's a bit inaccurate to single out Peru. Corruption is an issue throughout Latin America, and frankly, most of the current scandals that are in the news have their source from a company in Brazil, which is the Odebrecht company. And that has corrupted politics in Colombia, Peru, Brazil, Chile, Argentina, almost Ecuador, almost every country in the region. And so, if anything, what's going on in Peru is it shows a more effective judiciary, but in fact, the removal of Pedro Pablo Kuczynski was probably less about corruption than about his failure to maintain credibility in Congress and among the people. And it dates to political issues more than corruption.
Okay, that's really interesting.
And that's really...
Okay. That's really interesting. Listen, you mentioned Odebrecht. If anybody from Odebrecht is actually watching this program, I'd love to have you on the program to defend yourselves, because Odebrecht's at the center of a bunch of different countries when we talk of Latin America, construction projects, kickbacks, bribery, graft, you name it. Please come on our show. We'd love to have you on. But I want you, Javier, to address the point that Mark made about the fact that, if anything, this is more about politics than it is about corruption. You shook your head in disagreement. Tell me why.
Well, I partly agree with him. I'm not saying that I disagree completely with him. Odebrecht is just the latest episode of corruption. There's corruption in so many levels. What happened with President Kuczynski, and that's what caused his downfall, is the emergence of videos where a faction of Fuerza Popular, People's Force, the main party in Congress, members of this party were seen negotiating votes to prevent the impeachment of President Kuczynski from happening in December last year. That happened a few days ago when these videos emerged. Apparently, a member of parliament was offered some infrastructure investment in his region in exchange of a vote that would save President Kuczynski from from being ousted from power. That is actually, this was the tip of the iceberg.
Right.
The investigation of his companies, the investigation of Odebrecht paying one of his companies was still in process at the moment. Nothing has been proven yet, and he was supposed to appear before Congress and before the public prosecutor to explain this situation. But this was these videos that actually caused his downfall, and obviously it was, his position was unattainable, and he had to leave because there was no other way. He claims that he had nothing to do with that, but obviously when he was saved from impeachment, the first thing that he did was to pardon President Fujimoris, which is one of the things that had been offered in exchange of these votes in favor of him staying in power. So yes, it is Odebrecht, but also it is also these very, very sort of bad videos.
Victoria, for those who would look at it and say, well, if ruling party or governing party politicians are offering bribes and so forth to opposition politicians, they wouldn't do it without a certain amount of conviction that these guys might accept the bribes. The question being, is the political culture corrupt? Is the opposition as clean as they seem in this story?
You touch a very important point. There's certainly a demand side and a supply side to corruption, right? Certainly, the opposition is also tainted in alleged corruption scandals. We have Keiko Fujimori. There is actually an investigation into Odebrecht being involved in her campaign in 2011. Actually, Kenji is summoned to speak next April 6th, about this. So the truth is, and the very sad truth is, that absolutely, or almost everyone is involved in this scandal.
Yeah.
There are two sides of this story,
Right.
a demand
Marck,
side and a supply side.
Certainly. Mark, tell me about the Fujimoris, because they tend to appear on all sides of this debate right now. They're fascinating, aren't they?
Well, fascinating is one word. It underscores the issue that corruption is the banner that's being put forward, but this was really a power play. When charges of corruption were leveled at President Kuczynski back in January, he made a deal. He made a deal with Fujimori's son, who's a leader in Congress, and he saved himself. And the deal was pardon Alberto Fujimori. That was received poorly in Peru, and it was received poorly around the world, and it was received poorly in the human rights community. It was basically an affront to all the progress that had been made in terms of holding leaders responsible, not just for corruption, but for massive, major human rights violations and charges of, and actually Fujimori was convicted for crimes against humanity. Mm-hmm. He cut a deal to save his presidency. After that point, Kuczynski lost all credibility. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And now, when again they wanted to remove Kuczynski, he tried to cut deals again. And then these tapes that were referred to were revealed, and he had to resign. But what this was a power play between Kenji Fujimori, Alberto Fujimori, who was released from prison, against Fujimori's daughter, Keiko Fujimori. And it was really that division, first Kenji Fujimori against his sister, and then in this final deal, Keiko Fujimori aligning with the left to get the votes to impeach the president.
Yeah, it's almost
and so this was a power play to remove, to free Alberto Fujimori and basically a sibling rivalry from rival political parties.
Right. Yeah. As I say, almost Shakespearean within the family here. Javier, looking at the fact that they won't actually they won't let Kuczynski leave the country, is that a good idea given what happened with Toledo and the fact that he doesn't want to come back?
Well, yes, I mean, he's under investigation. He has to stay. In fact, he had promised to appear before the public prosecutor and in Congress to explain his position. He claimed that he knew nothing about the money from Odebrecht that went to his consultancy. Well, don't forget that he's been a banker and economist for almost all his life, and he had private businesses. He said that he knew nothing about this. It's very difficult to believe that that is the case because he owned the company. So how can he know how much money gets into the company? Or where that money comes from. So yes, he has to be prevented from leaving the country. So to prevent a situation like Toledo, who left, and he's now not going back to Peru, even though there is already a request for his extradition to Peru to face charges of corruption, alleged corruption as well. And the problem is that, going back to what Marck said, which is extremely important in the context of Peru, is that what happens in Peru and the political scene in Peru is determined by the civil war between Keiko Fujimori and her brother Kenji Fujimori. And that is the sad fact of Peruvian politics these days, that the fight of two siblings determines who is and who isn't in charge, who is and who isn't in power. Pablo Kuczynski, at some point, he was in office, but he wasn't in power, because it was Fujimori, either Keiko or Kenji, who would decide his actual fate. And it remains to be seen whether Mr. Vizcarra is going to accept that, because he's going to need votes in Congress to pass certain laws, and he's going to need the support of Kenji Fujimori to do that, because Keiko Fujimori obviously is very likely that she won't give him the votes he needs for certain projects. So that is the tragedy of Peruvian politics these days.
Right. Victoria, as we broaden this out, are we seeing greater accountability in the region, given that, hey, the president was forced to resign, corruption's on the tip of their tongues, everybody's talking about it, they're promising to end it. Are we seeing a regional shift, or is this just local?
The silver lining to all of this is that there is so much more information out there. There is so much more light shedded on the Odebrecht case. This has not only touched Peru, this is just the last case, but there are other 14 countries that have also been involved in the Odebrecht case. So if there's something good and positive out of this, is that there is information and we must deal with it. A good opportunity will come now with the Summit of the Americas that will actually take place in Lima. There were raising questions about the realizations of such summit, but President Vizcarra has said that it's still ongoing. And actually the topic of the summit is democratic governance against corruption. And not only heads of state will meet in this space, but also civil society organizations that have been pushing for accountability initiatives and have been pushing for harsher measures against corruption.
But Victoria, the point is that
this will be a critical...
Okay, but this was agreed when Kuczynski was president, right? So it sounds like satire. The Summit of Americas in Lima to talk about anti-corruption, all these things were on the agenda before the guy who was going to headline the summit went to jail, or rather was forced to step down for corruption and might go to jail. Doesn't it sound terribly ironic and maybe absurd to people?
You're absolutely right. It's ironic and it's confusing, but it's also a good opportunity because, as I mentioned, not only heads of state will meet at this summit. It will not only be canceled, that is good news, but also civil society organizations and other members of non-governmental organizations will meet at the summit, and they will have an opportunity to share with their peers measures, initiatives, strategies that both have worked and have not. So if there is a silver lining and if there is something positive coming out of the summit, is the recommendations of civil society.
Right.
So I'd say I remain optimistic. This is not a lost case. Not only it's confusing and it's ironic, yes, but this has been happening in Latin America for over a year now, Odebrecht specifically. So this summit is much needed and much urgent to nail down accountability actions towards governments.
Right. Marck, are you as optimistic about the Summit of Americas and what it can achieve?
No, I'm not. Corruption is as they say in the United States, everyone's for corruption. It's like being for apple pie. And so all politicians are against corruption, and politicians are using accusations of corruption against their enemies. And look at country after country, corrupt politicians are accusing corrupt politicians of corruption. In some cases, corrupt politicians are being forced to resign or move from office. And then another corrupt politician comes in. And so I'm not fully optimistic that we're seeing major progress. We are seeing stronger judicial action for good and for bad. Good politicians are being smeared, but we are seeing some judicial action, and we're seeing it, as was just mentioned, civil society. If there's going to be change here, it's going to be movements from civil society.
Right.
But this is a long process, and it's in every country in different ways. The process of anti-corruption is being corrupted by the politics of the country.
Right. Very finally, Javier, dirty politicians accusing dirtier politicians, or is there an opportunity here? Are we on the cusp of something good that might happen?
I don't think I agree with Mark about the summit. It won't make any difference. But I have a note of optimism about Peru. I have to. I'm a Peruvian. I'm hoping that something will get better. Martín Vizcarra has a very good background. He was the president of the region of Moquegua in the southern part of Peru. Peru is divided in regions, and each region has a president. And he was a president in 2010. He did a very good job there. His region was #1 in education. He solved a potential mining conflict in 2012. He doesn't seem to be involved in corruption because he was always in the private sector and he was never involved in public life until recently. And he's been very quick to start solving problems like going to the region in Piura, in the northern part of Peru, to try to solve the problem caused by the Niño phenomenon. So I'm going to give a note of optimism. I think that Vizcarra has a unique opportunity to start tackling this problem. He won't solve it, but he can start, and it will be up to future governments to continue this work. So I hope that Mr. Vizcarra does the job properly, and if he does, then we might be able to see the beginning of the end. It's going to be a long process, but the beginning of the end of corruption, at least in the case of Peru.
Okay, I've got a wrap. Javier, Victoria, and Mark, I thank you all for joining us on the Newsmakers. After this conversation, I'm a little better informed about power and money in Peru than I was before. Thanks again.